Chapter 4. Buccaneers and Blood Money: The Pirates' Place in Empire. Privateering was legalized piracy. The only difference was a signature from the crown. Marcus Rediker, Villains of All Nations. There's a romantic myth we tell about pirates. We imagine them as rebels, eyepatches, parrots, and plunder, rogue agents of chaos who defied the order of the sea. But history tells a far more strategic story. Pirates, especially those of the so-called Golden Age, were not outlaws in the eyes of empire. They were freelancers of imperial violence, often sanctioned, supported, and rewarded by the very states they supposedly defied. In truth, the pirate and the king were often business partners. And understanding that relationship reveals something crucial: the tools of theft, domination, and extraction were never just state-run. They were outsourced, privatized, monetized. Piracy, in its most dangerous form, wasn't rebellion. It was colonial capitalism in disguise. Privateering, theft by royal permission. Long before pirates were hunted, they were hired. In the 16th to 18th centuries, European monarchies issued letters of marque, legal documents authorizing private ships to raid enemy vessels in wartime. These privateers weren't criminals. They were state-sanctioned pirates. They pillaged for the crown, turned stolen cargo into royal revenue, and destabilized rival economies, all while keeping a generous cut for themselves. Francis Drake, for example, is celebrated as a hero of the British Empire. But his knighthood was earned through piracy, looting Spanish gold, attacking ports, and engaging in the early transatlantic slave trade. He was knighted not in spite of these acts, but because of them. Privateering blurred the line between criminality and policy. It showed that violence could be profitable, legal, and patriotic, all at once. The pirate as economic agent. While privateers operated under official licenses, many pirates were simply privateers without papers. Some were former naval officers who kept raiding after peace treaties were signed. Others were pushed into piracy by brutal naval service, economic desperation, or betrayal by their own empires. But regardless of origin, piracy served a larger function: it greased the gears of empire. Pirate havens like Nassau, Port Royal, and Tortuga became informal trading hubs, moving goods, information, and capital through shadow economies. Pirates disrupted imperial rivals, siphoned wealth from colonies, and challenged monopolies, ironically expanding the reach of global commerce. Stolen sugar, spices, silver, and enslaved people often re-entered legitimate markets, enriching merchants and financiers in London, Amsterdam, and Boston. Piracy was illegal on paper. But in practice, it was quietly absorbed into global capitalism. The black flag and the white wig. What makes piracy so telling isn't just the crime, it's the double standard. When European pirates attacked Spanish ships, they were celebrated. When African or indigenous resistance fighters attacked European ships, they were executed. When colonies broke from monarchies, they called it revolution. But when enslaved people revolted, they called it terrorism. Piracy reveals a truth too dangerous for textbooks. Theft is only called criminal when the wrong people do it. The same empires that condemned piracy practiced theft on a planetary scale, enclosing indigenous land, kidnapping millions from Africa, looting resources from Asia and the Americas. Their crowns glittered with stolen jewels. Their palaces were paid for in blood. But they had something pirates didn't: laws, flags, legitimacy. Rebellion becomes business. As empires matured, the need for rogue pirates declined, but the logic of private plunder endured. Colonial powers began issuing corporate charters instead of letters of marque. Companies like the British East India Company and Dutch VOC took piracy to the next level. They didn't just raid ships, they governed nations, commanded armies, and wrote trade policy. Piracy went corporate. The looting continued, legal, scalable, and systematic. What began as freelance plunder evolved into boardrooms, stock exchanges, and multinational colonial ventures. Today's megacorporations owe part of their lineage to this history. Their power isn't lawless, it's licensed. Just like the pirates once were. The pirate lives on. Pirates were eventually hunted down, not because they disrupted justice, but because they disrupted monopolies. Their downfall came not from moral reckoning, but from economic optimization. Empire didn't eliminate piracy. It internalized it. It replaced rum-soaked rebels with respectable raiders, banks, oil firms, and weapons contractors. Today, hedge funds short sovereign debt. Conglomerates mine rare earth metals on stolen land. Billionaires exploit tax loopholes crafted by their own lobbyists. And still, we tell stories about pirates as villains. When the real pirates wear suits, not swords. What pirates teach us about power? The history of piracy isn't a sideshow, it's a mirror. It shows how legitimacy is often a matter of branding, not morality. How law can sanctify theft, and how violence becomes virtue when it serves capital. It teaches us that rebellion, if profitable enough, becomes policy. And that the greatest crimes in history were never committed outside the law but with its blessing. This chapter traces how humanism, art, science, and theology converge not just to liberate the mind, but to justify hierarchy, ownership, and empire under a new intellectual banner, civilization. Chapter 5. The Renaissance Mindset. Control disguised as enlightenment. The most effective form of domination is not force, but faith in the system, in the story, in the superiority of your role within it. We often revere the Renaissance as the dawn of modern thought, the era that liberated Europe from medieval ignorance and birthed the foundations of democracy, science, and individual rights. But beneath this glow lies a more complicated truth. The Renaissance didn't interrupt domination, it repackaged it. It took the violent, hierarchical ideologies of feudal and religious authority and dressed them in new robes: art, architecture, philosophy, science, and law. This was not an age of equality. It was an age of sophisticated control. And the ideas born then still define what we consider civilized today. From divine rule to rational order. In the Middle Ages, power was justified by divine right. Kings ruled because God said so. The Church was the gatekeeper of truth. The Renaissance seemed to offer an alternative: reason over revelation. Humanism over dogma. But in practice, the power structures remained. Instead of divine kings, we had enlightened rulers. Instead of theological supremacy, we had racialized humanism. Man was redefined, no longer just as God's creation, but as a rational being capable of mastery over the world. But that man was almost always European, male, property-owning, and Christian. And from that narrow definition, a new hierarchy emerged, this time clothed in science and civilization. The commodification of land, bodies, and knowledge. Renaissance thinkers celebrated the idea of dominion, the right of men to subdue the earth and everything in it. Inspired by classical texts and biblical reinterpretation, land became something to possess, bodies something to use, and nature something to tame. This was the intellectual seedbed for enclosure of common lands in Europe. Colonial expansion justified by civilizing missions. Slavery and racial caste systems codified as natural hierarchy. Gender and class roles anchored in pseudoscientific essentialism. Philosophers like John Locke, often heralded as champions of liberty, wrote explicitly that land not being cultivated in a productive, i.e., European, way could be rightfully seized. He also invested in the Royal African Company, profiting directly from the slave trade. So while the Renaissance brought stunning artistic and intellectual achievements, it also laid the ideological framework for modern colonial capitalism. Art and architecture, aesthetic domination. Renaissance art celebrated the human form, perspective, and realism, but it also celebrated power. Palaces, cathedrals, and monuments were designed to awe, intimidate, and reinforce hierarchy. Portraits immortalized the rich and powerful. Mythology was reinterpreted to mirror aristocratic values. Perspective itself, a hallmark of Renaissance art, was used to structure scenes with order, focus, and hierarchy. The message was subtle but clear: some lives are meant to be framed, others painted out. Even beauty was a tool of domination. Science, race, and the myth of objectivity. The scientific revolution that accompanied the Renaissance wasn't free from ideology. In fact, it became one of the most powerful justifiers of inequality. Anatomical studies reinforced ideas of racial and gender inferiority. Measurements of skulls, bones, and skin were used to classify people into hierarchies of intelligence and civility. Nature was no longer sacred, it was an object to be dissected, extracted, and improved upon. This shift from interconnection to dominion made exploitation not just permissible, but inevitable, in the name of progress. The concept of objectivity, so central to modern science, was never neutral. It served the dominant worldview. It still does. Religion reinvented, not removed. Many assume the Renaissance weakened religion. In some ways it did. But in others it gave religion new weapons. Protestantism emphasized individual moral responsibility, which merged perfectly with the emerging capitalist ethos: salvation through work, thrift, and obedience. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church adjusted its doctrine to stay relevant, endorsing missions of conquest as spiritual duty. The moral language of domination remained. We conquer because we must save. We steal because we civilize. The invention of the uncivilized. The greatest psychological export of the Renaissance wasn't art or reason, it was the idea of the other. To define what was civilized, Europe had to define what was not. And so began the systematic labeling of African, indigenous, Asian, and Middle Eastern cultures as backward, irrational, primitive, or demonic. This wasn't ignorance. It was strategy. By naming others as less than human, Europe justified theft, slavery, and genocide as moral duties. This mindset survives today in development economics, foreign policy, media portrayals, and educational canons. The colonized world remains undeveloped in the same frameworks that Europe invented to justify its superiority. Progress as a tool of control. The Renaissance mindset wasn't just about power, it was about making power feel good. It turned domination into duty, conquest into culture, ownership into order. We are still living in that spell. We speak of civilized nations, underdeveloped regions, progressive policies, all using language rooted in a hierarchy of value that began 5 centuries ago. The Renaissance didn't destroy the old world. It painted it gold. Next up, Chapter 6. The Constitution of Control. We'll dismantle the mythology of democratic founding documents and explore how constitutions have historically served property over people, enshrining inequality as law. Chapter 6. The Constitution of Control. The Constitution is not a neutral document. It is a blueprint, designed by and for the landowning elite. The Constitution is often treated as sacred scripture. We're taught to revere it as a living symbol of liberty, equality, and the rule of law. In schoolrooms, courtrooms, and political debates, it's invoked with almost religious fervor, etched in marble, cited in protest, and held up as the pinnacle of civilization. But few ask a more dangerous question: what was it really designed to protect? Because once we strip away the myth and examine the document with clear eyes, a disturbing truth emerges. The Constitution wasn't written to ensure freedom. It was written to organize control. Not control of chaos but of people. Not protection from tyranny but protection of property. A document written by owners for owners. In the United States, the framers of the Constitution were overwhelmingly wealthy white men, many of them landowners, slaveholders, and creditors. They didn't represent the common man, they represented the economic elite. Their primary concern wasn't democracy. It was stability. Specifically, the kind of stability that protected their holdings from popular uprising. James Madison, one of the chief architects, famously wrote that the purpose of government was to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. This wasn't rhetorical flourish, it was design. And that design shows up in every clause. The Electoral College, to prevent direct democracy. The Senate was structured to favor land-rich states. The Three-Fifths Compromise legally dehumanized black people to preserve Southern power. The Fugitive Slave Clause criminalized escape from bondage across state lines. These weren't accidental oversights. They were strategic decisions. The Constitution didn't bend toward justice. It bent toward preserving wealth. Property before people. If there's a single thread running through the entire document, it's this: property must be protected at all costs. Whether that property was land, capital, or human beings. The language of liberty, due process, equal protection, justice, was only applied selectively. In the 18th century, it applied to a tiny sliver of the population, white, male, property-owning citizens. Everyone else, enslaved people, indigenous nations, women, poor whites, existed outside the full protections of the document. And even after slavery was abolished, the logic remained. Control the franchise. Limit access. Protect capital. Amendments are not antidotes. It's often said that the Constitution is self-correcting. That the Bill of Rights and later amendments expanded freedom and corrected past wrongs. There's some truth to that. But it's also deeply misleading. The Constitution has only ever changed when pressure from below forced it. Abolition. Suffrage. Civil rights. These were not graceful evolutions. They were the result of struggle, protest, blood, and rebellion. And even then, the system adapted to maintain its foundations. The 13th Amendment ended slavery, except as punishment for a crime, opening the door to mass incarceration. The 14th and 15th Amendments granted citizenship and voting rights, but were undermined by Jim Crow, poll taxes, and literacy tests. The 19th Amendment granted women the vote, but not power, as economic and political barriers remained intact. In other words, amendments did not dismantle the machine. They made it more efficient, more palatable, and more complex. The Constitution as myth. Every nation has a founding myth. The Constitution is the American one. It tells a story of noble intention, wise men, and universal principles. But like all myths, it requires selective memory and strategic forgetting. It forgets that the same document that guaranteed liberty also guaranteed slavery. That the same founders who spoke of freedom also crushed uprisings by the poor. That the same system that glorifies checks and balances also enabled genocide, war, and systemic exclusion. And the myth continues today, when courts uphold discriminatory laws in the name of originalism, or when corporations claim constitutional rights to avoid regulation. The Constitution is not a neutral tool. It is an ideology. Control disguised as consent. Perhaps the Constitution's greatest trick is convincing people that they consented to their own management. That voting equals power. That legality equals legitimacy. That liberty exists because it's written on paper. But what if the purpose of the Constitution isn't to distribute power, but to concentrate it invisibly? What if it was designed not as a liberation manual, but as an operating system for elite dominance, updated slightly over time, but never fundamentally rewritten? And what if its true genius lies not in its flexibility, but in its ability to absorb dissent without ever relinquishing control? Chapter 7: Education Gatekeeping the Truth. It is